Welcome to Lecture 9 of our series on prosody, on perception. Now, we've seen a lot of prosodic properties so far, and hopefully you've been able to perceive all of them. We can't explain exactly how that happens. Many aspects of perception are not well understood. But for two properties, loudness and pitch, psychoacoustics, that is the study of audio perception, can tell us a lot. Back in Lecture 5, I mentioned that every prosodic property has three aspects: the perceptual, the articulatory, and the acoustic. So considering loudness, for example, we have the articulatory mechanism, increased subglottal pressure and airflow increase, for example, and the acoustic measure of log intensity. That is to say, the perception of loudness is well correlated with log intensity. For arbitrary crazy sounds that you might see in auditory illusions, the relationship breaks down. But for speech signals, simple log intensity is a reasonable approximation for perception, assuming you're using controlled stimuli or otherwise dealing with microprosodic effects. Anyway, the rest of this lecture will focus on pitch perception, since it's the best understood, and since there are some interesting myths that we need to debunk. All right, so just as pitch production relies on special hardware, our vocal folds, pitch perception relies on special hardware, our ears. Sound travels through the outer ear, which enhances certain frequency direction pairings, through the ear canal, eardrum, ossicles to the cochlea. That's that little snail thing there. The cochlea is frequency sensitive, and in fact the hair cells responsible for detecting the different frequencies are nicely arranged, high frequency toward the outside, low frequency deeper in the coils. So some frequency information is computed directly in the ear, but pitch perception happens mostly in the brain. And there things get complicated. I wish it was easy like the ear, but many parts of the brain are involved in pitch perception, as shown by neuroimaging research. We know that different aspects of pitch are represented in different places, for example, emotional prosody versus linguistic prosody, and probably represented in different ways. But basically, we know that F0, which is roughly the rate of glottal closures, and pitch are monotonically related. That is, as F0 increases, perceived pitch goes up. Again, forgetting for the moment the microprosody issues. The exact relation is sort of an issue. It could be linear, in which case we should always talk in terms of raw F0, measured in hertz, as our pitch proxy, or it might be log scale, in which case we should always use log F0. Before we go on, I should just erase a little bit of the graph because, as you know, most people can't perceive sounds as having pitch if the frequency is below 30 hertz or so. And most human voices can't produce sounds with pitch below 50 hertz or so. Okay, I left you in suspense. The answer for music is log scale. That's how we perceive F0 for music. So from 100 hertz to 200 hertz is an octave. So is 200 hertz to 400 hertz. So there's more hertz in the second difference, but it's the same ratio. So log scale. Musicians, of course, break up each octave into 12 steps called semitones. And so semitones are a convenient unit for talking about log hertz. Perceptions of the pitch of speech are more complex than music, but log scale is still the most common choice. One good reason to use log hertz, it compensates for range differences. So here you see a male and a female voice saying the same thing. It looks like the female has a lot more range in her voice. The difference between the top and the bottom in terms of hertz is much higher for the female voice, but in terms of a ratio, it's not. So if we're using linear hertz, we'll always get confused about these things. If you map them to log hertz, you plot it that way, you report differences that way, you can correct for much of that. All right, so got a couple little examples about pitch perception. For this one, I'd like you to just listen and pay attention to the last word. Is it in pitch, high or low in pitch?
It's mandatory. You have to graduate, to get the degree, you have to take this class.
All right, is the word class low or high? Here's that last part again.
You have to take this class.
Okay, well, whatever you think, some people will disagree with you. Even the pitch tracker may disagree with you. Don't be intimidated. right? An algorithm is just an algorithm. Your actual perception is what you perceive. But why do people differ? Well, creaky voice is coming in here. So the higher pitch with a creaky voice is perceived as a lower pitch, if it really is higher, if it has creaky voice. People do differ. Things like this can drive musicians crazy, right? So for music, you always need to know what note is being played, and you can always tell if it's higher or lower than another note. For speech perception, that's not the case. One more little experiment. This is just a 2-word phrase. Listen for whether it's rising or falling at the end.
Speech prosody.
Okay, here it is again.
Speech prosody.
Okay, when I first heard this, I thought it was falling, but some perceive a final rise. Listening through headphones may make that possibility clearer. It may also help to look at a graph. So this shows a tiny pitch upturn, kind of at the limits of perception. This graph is a little more sophisticated than the Pratt graphs we saw earlier, where F0 was just a thin blue line. Here, though, it's more of a ribbon. The width and the darkness vary with the periodicity. So periodicity fades out as the sound gets more breathy or creaky or just quieter. And so at the end, when the periodicity is fading out, the perceptive pitch is weaker. I asked you to talk about rise or fall. So in this case, the percept at the end may be so weak it doesn't affect your overall judgment of whether the slope is going up or going down. Here it is again.
Speech prosody.
Okay, now maybe you appreciate the ambiguity. Okay, so I have chosen these examples deliberately to be tricky ones. And while people do differ, most of the time we are on the same page. In particular, at vowel centers, where there's high periodicity, the perception of pitch tends to be robust and consistent. All right, just to summarize, there's a lot of myths about pitch. You got to be really careful. Pitch is not the same for music and speech. It's not informative everywhere equally. It's not objective. It's not the whole story. We need to identify the presence of creaky voice and other things that mess with our perceptions. And the last 2 points just reiterate comments made in Lecture 5. So sure, we will use pitch, but always remember the complexities. Now, I wish I could tell you that the perceptual aspects of speech are well understood. Ideally, the brain scientists could tell us exactly what people are extracting from the speech signal, but that's not possible today. So instead, our inventories of prosodic properties are based on a lot of indirect evidence, mostly leveraging facts about what native speakers use when they're interpreting meaning, and some intuitions and observations about articulation. So the bottom line is that our list of prosodic properties is built on sand. It's not solidly tied to anything we can experimentally measure. And sometimes perceptions are faint or inconsistent. But that's life. Prosody is still very useful, and we will move forward assuming that these things have some foundation and correlate in some way with what we actually perceive. One last comment on the topic of perception. This may be incredibly obvious, but hearing is not like vision. So if I ask you to spot the differences between two pictures, you can scan them over, your eyes can move back and forth. They're there, available statically for as long as you want. Every part of it is always fresh. You can see all the pieces together and focus on one. Audio is different. Sound is fleeting. More technically, I can say the echoic memory, also called the auditory buffer, is volatile. So if you hear a sound or a phrase, for a second or so, that's very clear in your mind. So if I ask you to contrast good job and good job, you can do that much better if those two are within that 1 second window. If there's a longer time period, it gets really hard. It's a very fundamental limitation. As researchers or as humans trying to deal with sound, we can compensate in different ways. If we can present the two things juxtaposed next to each other, we can use visualizations, which of course are static, or we can measure things. And in a couple of lectures, we will talk about both of those things in detail. All right, so that wraps up our series on production and perception. Starting with the next lecture, we'll be talking about the linguistic functions of prosody, starting with tone and stress.